Welcome everyone here and at home to the City Council work session for September 22nd. And the purpose of this meeting is to share all possible information on the City Hall discussion. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor. And before I turn over to the team, just a couple of quick comments to kind of frame the workshop today. At the December 8th, 2014 work session, the Council passed a motion to pause the work of the City Hall project in order to clarify Council direction. Tonight, RBA, Rao Brokaw and Associates, and the City Hall design team will outline their process over the past year and a half for developing and analyzing design options that incorporate the 5 project goals, which are identity, participation, simplicity, stewardship, and Eugene at 200. The design team will also detail how their research and technical analysis, along with the project values, has been applied to develop the final concept design. The work session on Wednesday will provide Council an opportunity to clarify direction and prior decisions on City Hall. I thought it would be helpful to provide a bit of context for the direction that has guided the work of the design team and staff for the past 18 months. In December 2012, Council provided direction to complete analysis for the rebuild, i.e. a major renovation, and build new options for City Hall on the current site. In January of 2013, Council provided direction to pursue a City Hall design on the current site with the goal of retaining the Council chamber, existing parking to the extent possible, and public art, as well as any other components that make sense from an operational or design standpoint. RBA's current concept design incorporates the project values and goals into this Council direction. Their design also demonstrates that City Hall can be located on a half block, including activating the corner of 8th and Pearl with a plaza, which increases accessibility to the community and builds a connection to the park blocks. The half-block site plan can accommodate a Phase 2 in the future of up to 100,000 square feet. The placement of City Hall in the half-block leaves the door open to potential development opportunities on the remaining half a block, for example, to accommodate a year-round farmers market on the Butterfly lot. As you will hear tonight, through extensive analysis, we have learned that the existing structure is not in as good a condition as previously believed. And the results of the design team's research, analysis, and design work indicate that the current concept design based on new construction best reflects the project goals and values. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike and his team.
Thank you. The city has been proceeding in a thoughtful and deliberative way since 1999 to incrementally address problems associated with City Hall. The current process has been a natural progression of that deliberative approach, and the recommended concept design and site framework are a continuation of this incremental approach to solving problems within our means. I personally didn't come to this current recommendation easily. 3 years ago, when I first hired RBA to do a new building study and Patisha Architects to do a renovation study, I was firmly in the remodel camp. And in fact, as recently as a year and a half ago, when RBA and the team were hired, I was still in that camp and pressed hard for them to do a good job on the remodel option because I thought for a number of reasons that would give the best outcome. But today I can no longer recommend that. In fact, for some time I haven't been able to recommend that because I believe that the work that this design team and project team has done will indicate that according to our project goals and costs that a new construction option is the best way to go. This is a very talented design team. It includes experts in sustainable design, both regionally and nationally, and they've done a tremendous amount of work and research into what the building can support and what a remodel option and a new option can give us. And so tonight we've invited them to speak about what their research indicated. As we've gone along, we haven't had the opportunity to share as much along the way as perhaps we would have liked to support that. So tonight is the opportunity to fill in any of those gaps. So they will provide background information to you, and then like you to ask whatever questions you have to support the decision-making process for Wednesday. So for that, with that, I'd like to introduce some of the key members here. We've got John Rowell next to me and Karen Knudsen with Rao Brokaw Architects. We've got Scott Wolf and Aidan Dunning here from the Miller Hull Partnership. We've got John McDonald, our structural engineer from Katina Engineering. Mark Brunet, mechanical engineer and associate of PAE Consulting Engineers, Brian Vanneman from Leland Consulting, who has given us advice on development opportunities and so on, and we've got other design team members in the audience, including Jim Mender, our superintendent from our general contractor. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to John.
Thanks, Mike. Can we advance the slide? Yeah, so on July 14th, this is a familiar image to you, we brought to you a design direction after meeting with you back in February, and we were on a path, and it was how do we get to designs like this? It's not an arbitrary process or a whim or our decision. It's really a thoughtful process. It is built on goals. You can go to the next slide, and you've seen these. They're goals that people can understand. They're imageable. They're real. They're things that you can measure the project against. And where did we get those? We built those with you out of the project values. And you, the council, formed these values, and they really do matter. You can do other things if you change your values, but it's really important to look at a design and a direction, the decisions you're making relative to your goals and to your values. So we've gotten to a point, next slide, where questions have come up. And these are certainly current. If you open the paper or you listen to the news, isn't renovation cheaper? Isn't it more sustainable to renovate? Have you studied alternatives? Have you studied renovation? And you may have other questions, and we'd love to answer those and help you reaffirm decisions in the process that you've gone through so far.
So this is an image that you've seen a few times before, and it's an image that we've shown to the community as we've presented this project and provided updates to stakeholder groups on the work of the last year and a half. On the upper portion, it's describing a design process that is iterative, that takes advantage of the expertise of an integrated design team and an integrated process that takes advantage of information on costing at different points in that process, so you can be certain that you're on track towards something that is achievable within the project's goals and means, and that brings a recommendation forward that meets all of the project's goals, meets the scope of work that is expected, and meets the project budget, given everything that we know. On the lower portion of this slide is a description of the public process that we've been working through with the community.
Speak up just a little bit. I know it's hard, but you've got a whole room full of people who would like to hear you.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Everyone is meant to be in. Better. So this is a diagram that we've shown for the last year and a half to the public and to stakeholder groups as we've been talking about this work and this project. The upper portion of this diagram is a description of the design process that we've been working through. It's an iterative process that takes advantage of the expertise of our full integrated design team, which means not just architects, but also engineers, our construction manager, general contractor, that refines options that we might think are architecturally interesting with information related to cost, energy, feasibility, and narrows from a wide range of alternatives to, in February and then again in July, a single recommendation that we could bring forward and then ask additional questions of council related to design options within that renovation or within that recommendation. We've studied the full range of options from a renovation focus to building new over the last year and a half, and we'll be talking with you a little bit about what those studies have taught us in the last year and a half. And the bottom portion of this image is about the work that we've done to inform the community along the way in this process. We've met with more than 30 stakeholder groups over the last year and a half to keep them apprised of the work, and we've been trying to make sure that the public is well informed about the direction that has been coming from the work and from what we've learned in the last year and a half, and that they would also be in a position to ask good questions about the project going forward. So this is one other way of thinking about that process that I just described, which is essentially taking all of the previous work, the 15, 16 years of study that have gone into the City Hall project, that and input from very extensive public engagement, public involvement processes, and funneling that through the project's core values, what we understand from history, the project's goals, and coming to a first collection of alternatives, of design options that we could consider. Refining that further with input input from cost and expertise on our team, and then coming to finally a single recommendation that we could bring forward to council for consideration.
So one question that's pretty easy to put to rest is, aren't you architects just interested in new buildings? Most of our work, Raoul Broca Architects in Eugene, has been renovating buildings, and I think we've been doing a great job as a city in the last 10, 20 years, reusing our buildings. This is an example where we took an aircraft hangar at Lane Community College and turned it into an art school. Our own building at 1 East Broadway is a reuse. First on Broadway, across the street, Straub Hall on campus, a lot of exciting things happening, and when it makes sense, we're completely on reusing buildings.
And Miller Hall as well has a long history of both restoration work and renovation work. The image that you're seeing here is the original University of Washington shell house. This was the home for the 36 gold medal Olympic winning crew team, and it had been in need of upgrading and meeting today's standards for the athletes that are practicing there. This is a renovation project, so it was taking the bones of that facility. The bones in this case were very strong. Obviously, there was a historical and cultural link to the site, and turning that into a facility that is appropriate for modern crew teams and other athletes at University of Washington. So it was that attitude that we, as a collective team, brought to the initial study phases of this project. Again, looking at one end of the spectrum of pure restoration, bringing the City Hall back to its original state, to a renovation project, which was to use the bones and upgrade it to its current, meet its current needs, all the way through a series of hybrid schemes to a new build scheme. And what you're seeing here on the screen is just a series of site plan diagrams looking at those range of options, not only within the building itself, but what the result of that option, what impact that would have on broader urban planning and the city structure itself. So we wanted to take you through a couple of those because, again, this work is work that has been shared with the policy team and the project team as we've moved along, bringing you recommendations at certain points, but you haven't seen this work to date. And this option one is really the scheme that's looking at taking the existing City Hall and reusing that. And what you're seeing in the heavy red outline is the current space needs of the Phase 1 of City Hall, and that's occupying essentially the south and portion of the east wing along High Street, as well as reusing Council Chamber in its existing location and configuration. It reserves the ability to develop in a future phase the shell of the existing structure on the north side of the site and along Pearl. So again, what this scheme is looking at doing is taking some of the project goals that have developed, welcoming, accessible, civic heart, increasing accessibility into the existing structure, and renovating the structure at one end of the spectrum. And a couple of the other options as we move through, I won't go into as much detail on these, but in this case, looking at a hybrid scheme where we're reutilizing the south, east, and portion of the north along High for the Phase 1 City Hall needs, and then looking at some alternate uses along Pearl and reserving the right to develop in a future phase the remaining shell. Ideas of reusing the south side of the existing City Hall and possibly looking at moving Council Chamber to Pearl so that it would have more of a public presence on a public street. As you know, the existing chamber within the donut of the existing structure is relatively hidden from the sidewalk in the public way. Another idea that looks at developing really the new smaller City Hall along Pearl, thinking that there might be some synergies with the existing county building across Pearl, and then retaining a portion of the southeast corner of City Hall as a pavilion that could house various events and work with the plan for the Great Street along 8th down to the river to enliven that. And then an option that looks at a new structure, taking up what you can see here is about 2/3 of the width of the block along 8th, and reserving the majority of the existing site as a land bank for future development. That could be for co-location in Phase 2, could be for other development. The point here is that it retains some flexibility going forward. And then the last scheme was looking at taking the south side of the site and incorporating the existing council chamber in a new structure, and then reserving the north half of the site for a land bank use in the future, whether that's co-location of city facilities or other development opportunities as the market would dictate. Yes, so each of these 6 schemes came with initial conceptual cost model that was done with our cost consultant on the team. And each of these was evaluated, again, as I mentioned, with the policy team and the project team. And the goal of that wasn't to pick one of the 6 and move forward. It was to find the best ideas, the strongest ideas out of each of the 6. So if you advance one slide, the result of that investigation, as we filtered those strongest ideas, we came to 3 distinct options. And you can see the top is renovate. That's essentially the renovation of the existing City Hall, addressing some of the significant deficiencies that it does have now and that we all recognize. The hybrid scheme, which was renovating the south portion and a portion of the east wing, looking at an idea of relocating council chamber to Pearl and reserving the north half of the site for either Phase 2 development or future alternate development. Or the bottom scheme, which was a build new scheme that looked at the merits of and costs of building new versus the renovation cost of the existing structure. And that work, again, with the policy team and the project team, resulted in a recommendation that this team brought to you in February that looked at a framework based on the build new scheme that created a 2-story city hall, new build, along 8th with a public plaza to activate that great street to the river, reserve the ability and land bank to the north for a future Phase 2, and along High Street for public or private development as the market would dictate. After February, there was an opportunity that was presented based on the land exchange between the city and the county, excuse me, for effectively the butterfly lot to expand Farmers Market in exchange for the east side of this site. So our team was charged with looking at how that decision or that opportunity would affect the development framework that we had proposed in February. We spent a couple of months looking at the ability to consolidate Phase 1 and the full Phase 2 co-location opportunity on the west half of this site. And you can see here the framework diagram that supports that. And as part of the land exchange, we were tasked with looking at the opportunity for the new county courthouse to go on the east side of the site, which again, the result of that study proved that we could do that. That is a feasible thing to consider and to do. And it also started to look at ideas of really reactivating the ground plane at City Hall and tying Phase 1 into the future Phase 2 to the north. And that framework was really built on this idea of turning City Hall back to the people of Eugene. That we felt that through some initial analysis, the existing facility was maybe less transparent, which speaks a little bit about how government occurs in our modern society. It's inward focusing. There's some issues with connection that the team has identified with the public way. And this was an idea of turning that ground plane back over to the people of the city and allowing that ground plane to move through the building as a way to draw people in, whether they were attending a council meeting, had other business with the city, or using art as a magnet to begin to activate that space. And that was some of the, in a very quick nutshell, some of the work that this team engaged in, again, not in isolation, but with a lot of involvement from the city's policy team, from the city's project team, as we studied options that ranged from full renovation to new build. And as John mentioned earlier, in July, this is the rendering and as part of the scheme that we brought to council for your direction to move forward. And then as John mentioned in his introductory remarks, this pause to bring to you more information on how we got from the beginning of the project to this point.
So obviously, this is a new build direction, and you see we looked right from complete renovation to new build. So once again, a question which, when you move forward with that, people ask, wait a second, why doesn't renovation make sense? And we'll go take you into some more technical detail. But one of the issues is cost. Is it cheaper to renovate or build new? That was an important question. Accessibility. Can we remove the barriers? What kind of city hall do we want to have? An accessible and welcoming one? What about the structure? How flexible is that? How adaptable is it? Energy. We have energy goals. What's the development value? Propositions that the existing building and site are worth many millions of dollars. And coming back again to the beginning, which is you always guide design with your values and your goals. And if you aren't achieving those, you really have to ask, even if something is cheaper, if it's not achieving your goals, why do it? So, next slide. There have been questions raised about the project based on an estimate done in 2011 by Turner Construction that was intended to support conceptual analysis. And Mike engaged my firm and Autopatisha in that study.
And I also engaged Turner Construction to do the cost estimate. I'd just like to interject here that those cost estimates were meant to be a very high-level look at what's possible, and were never intended to base a construction budget for a real project. It was merely to inform the opportunities and challenges of the sort of two ends of the spectrum, renovation versus build new, for the purposes of informing a citizen advisory committee. And they concluded that we could go with either, but regardless, we would have to do a great deal more study to get real costs in a real project.
But since the 2011 study is being held up to support real decision making now, we have to go back and with the knowledge that we have, and this new knowledge, because we've been working on this for a year and a quarter, and working within our cost estimating discipline, which is a professional discipline, and we look at that cost estimate, what do we know? What do we know now, maybe that they didn't know then? There are things that have been learned, and we'll go into a little more detail with on structural and energy, but in that estimate, there was an inadequate assessment of what the structural upgrades needed to be. Not surprising in a very quick conceptual study. There was inadequate understanding of the improvements required for construction, and these include seismic upgrade. There was an inadequate understanding of what the thermal envelope would need to be to meet your goals and your expectations, which are a higher standard than what we were talking about in 2011. No cost to address sagging floors and deflecting structure that happens over time. An inadequate allowance for the mechanical system. We know it needs to be replaced in the building. There was only one elevator in the estimate, and that served unoccupied space, future shelled space. Clearly that would not meet your goals for an accessible city hall. And underestimated square foot costs. Often at the beginning of an estimate and a conceptual level, you do your best, but time is tight, and you're trying to get a conceptual understanding. And so what is standard practice, and what we do early in an estimate, is to apply what's called a design contingency. You could think of it as an allowance. Some may think, oh, that's an additional fudge factor. No, it's because you don't know enough at the beginning. And the standard number that we would use for a diagram that we would see in 2011 would be 20%. That's not in the estimate at all. It goes a ways to accounting for the unknowns. Another obvious one is that's 2011. We're talking about a construction. We're doing our cost estimates for a start in 2015. So we have 4 years of escalation. That's known, and that's 16.5%. So you take 20 and 16 together, even if we didn't know all the details, you're talking about a cost estimate that really is not within hundreds of thousands of dollars, but is off by millions. It's 2011. It's go to the next slide. I guess what we could conclude from that is It served its purpose in its time, but for today, it's incomplete. It's out of date. It does not meet the requirements that we know are the requirements of the project. It's missing contingency and structural improvements alone that are equal to 30 to 40%. So we're probably talking more like 50%. And it's not a basis for decisions related to this project. We've done other cost estimating, and we mentioned that for each of those schemes you saw earlier, we did initial cost estimating. We know more now, and we can talk about those if you're interested in what would it actually cost in 2015 to do, say, a remodel scheme.
I'd also like to interject that 2011 cost estimate was evaluated by the professional cost estimator working on our team, but also by McKinsey Commercial Construction, professionals in Raul Brocaw's office with extensive experience with complex renovations, professionals in Miller Hull Partnerships office with the same experience with complex renovations, as well as the city facilities staff. So it is a background piece of research that has been looked into extensively by 5 different entities.
But obviously there are other issues. This is not just about cost. It's connecting to goals and values. One goal is to make an accessible and welcoming City Hall. So when you look at it, yes, it's true that we can make improvements. But one of the questions we had, and this is a structural question, is how adaptable is this structure? We know it's not acceptable as it is. We know we need to make improvements if we're to reuse the structure. And that was a really important line of questioning and investigation that we asked John McDonald, our structural engineer, to explore.
So this diagram indicates a plan view of the building, and the yellow highlighted lines in there are the control joints, because the structural system is a post-tension waffle slab. So what post-tension means is they have regular rebar in there that you've probably seen everywhere, and the post-tension is a tendon that's stretched pretty much like a rubber band that helps alleviate some of the dead load of the structure, therefore making it thinner. They work just fine until you want to cut into them and renovate them. So these yellow lines indicate a pretty rigid constraint about where we could cut that structure without doing a whole lot of additional work. Yes, you can cut at other locations, but it requires quite a bit more construction work as well as design analysis work. The next slide shows a pretty classical failure and I hesitate in the word failure here. It's a concrete crack. Concrete does crack, so we shouldn't get too excited about that word failure there. But it's a classical crack for post-tension construction from the mid-60s. Those rubber bands that I mentioned that are tendons inside there, they compress and shrink that waffle slab, and therefore the columns tend to all point to the middle or the midspan of the bay. And this is a corner column, and it even shows up well here in this projector, where that crack is a pretty sizable crack that we can see from here. Based on some of the historical documents given to us by the city, this was first begun to be looked at and known as something that needed to be fixed in the mid-70s, and it's been going on since then. The next slide shows a column that's along the flat side of the building at the perimeter, and you can tell it's leaning one direction. If you continue down this sidewalk, the following column would probably be pointing back towards the middle of that building. The lines we drew in kind of give a good gauge of that's a pretty substantial change. Some of the fixes that can be done, and those were not included in the cost estimate that we just discussed, those can be fixed, but they, in addition, they would close off that parking garage downstairs. So making it open and inviting, that's kind of counter to the values that we were aiming at. In 1964, which is when the building was designed, if those earthquake loads, let's say 100 pounds, what they would be designed for today would be closer to 400 pounds. So we're about a third to a quarter of the strength that would be required by code today. The next slide shows typical concrete creeping. The slab that supports the chambers is elevated and separate from the rest of the slab that is pretty much the lid to the parking garage. It would need its own lateral system beneath it. And at the corners of these, you can see from the picture that corner has drooped down, let's say, at least 2 inches. I think it was more like 2.5. When concrete creeps, you can't just put a post and kind of push it back up or maybe pull it back up. It's creeped and it's set, so we'd have to add more structure to that to make that flat. Once you add more structure, that's more weight. When you have to add even more structure, you begin chasing your tail to make things flat. Those changes were not included in that cost estimate. The next slide is the council chambers, and this is the part that we understand is a strong desire to save the council chambers. Those earthquake loads I talked about increasing by about a factor of 4, that would change the appearance of the structure. Additionally, there are just engineering things that I don't want to get too technical, but as an example, the moment frame, it's a steel moment frame, inside of there, and the little nubs that we see poking up on top of the council there. On the next slide, we'll see a kind of a wire frame showing what the structure is. So after the Northridge earthquake, it was about 1994, the code provisions changed, and we're limited that we can't make steel moment frames that look quite like this anymore. They're a lot heavier. There is a fix for this. We've done renovations as well. We can renovate this. There is no elegant solution, and we wouldn't retain the identity of the council chambers if we were to renovate that.
So in addition to some of the structural issues or concerns that John just pointed out, if we look more closely at the council chamber, in previous sessions we brought to you some of the issues that we know that we would need to address with the existing chamber if it was to be reused. There's technological issues, there's acoustical issues, there's entry issues, there's capacity issues, and we've identified envelope issues as well. We talked a little bit about that earlier. The translucent panels that you see at the drum, that's basically a free path for heat to go out of the chamber. So basically the energy you're spending to heat the chamber is effectively just going right out that drum. So we know that if we were to reuse the chamber, we would need to make significant upgrades to the envelope of the chamber. And Mark's going to talk a little bit more about how those envelope upgrades really aren't isolated to the chamber, but begin to ripple through the rest of the existing building if we were to bring that up to current codes or even beyond that to meet your sustainability goals.
So before I jump into everything, I guess two definitions to understand as I go through these slides. The first is EUI, which is Energy Use Index. It's essentially the gas mileage rating of your building, except that in this case, a lower number is better than a higher number. The second is a thermal bridge, and a thermal bridge is a term that we use when we talk about insulating a building. You can think about it as if insulating the building were damming a river, and the water flowing through the river is the heat you're losing out of the building. The dam is the insulation that you're putting up in your building. A thermal bridge is going to be a gap in that dam that heat is going to keep flowing out of. And the problem with a thermal bridge is that you can't make the dam higher to deal with it. You can't add insulation everywhere else. You have to deal with the thermal bridge itself. You have to fill that in to stop the heat loss out of your building. So with that, on the next slide, your building has an EUI over the last 7 years from the data that we've seen of about 130. So a typical building around Eugene would probably be 70 to 80, maybe 90 EUI points. That's an average building, not particularly good. Your building's heating energy alone, or I should say the current City Hall's heating energy alone, has an EUI of 70, so almost as much as a typical building will use in total just in heating. Now there's two major architectural features of this building that contribute to that. And on the next slide here, this is actually a slice of the building looking at just one portion of the building that sort of illustrate these two features. And on the next slide here, the building loses heat around the perimeter. Because this building is actually composed of 5 separate small one-story buildings that are up on a pedestal that all have 6 sides, it has a tremendous amount of perimeter area, of surface area to the volume of the building. So its ratio of surface area to volume is just much larger than a typical building, and that means there's a lot more room for heat loss. So the way we deal with that is with more insulation all around it. And on the next slide, you can start to see. So you have to insulate the entire ceiling of the parking garage or above on the floor. Add more insulation to the roof, and that starts to deal with the problem. The next problem is the thermal bridges that I talked about. And concrete is a very poor insulator. It's a good conductor of heat. The building has has a concrete slab edge that is exposed all the way around it, which is essentially a radiator. It's a fin all around the building, right there, yeah, that you continuously lose heat out of. All of the columns that support the building are thermal bridges. There's walls in the basement that extend up to the first floor. Those are all thermal bridges. You have to deal with all of those to bring this building essentially up to a 21st century level of insulation. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. It's difficult, and difficult is just going to mean expensive, and you're going to end up with a building that doesn't look quite like the building that does now, because you're going to have to cover it in insulation to deal with these. So getting back to the energy targets then of the building, so the EUI right now is an EUI of about 130. It's been for the last 7 years. The proposed EUI of the new construction would be an EUI of 30. So, 25% or so of the existing building. An EUI of 30 is an aggressive goal, but it's not a tremendous reach goal. Our office, Miller Hall's office, we're both involved in the design of the Bullitt Center in Seattle. The Bullitt Center is currently operating with an EUI of about 10. So we feel really comfortable we could hit an EUI of 30. That's not a problem. When John and I first started talking about the potential EUI of the new building, of the renovation, I threw out, probably we could get to 75, maybe 90. We do a lot of renovations, and we see often, 20 or 30% benefit or reduction in energy use in those buildings. John pressed me a little further and said, well, what if we really do a good job with the insulation and we start to deal with all those thermal bridges and we put in a new HVAC system? How far could we get? And we ran some numbers, no real modeling, but we think we could probably get down to an EUI of 45. And that would be a tremendous, tremendous achievement from 130 that it's at right now. It would also be a tremendous challenge, and I would not feel as comfortable saying, yeah, we can hit 45. I think that's theoretically possible. It is an amazing challenge. So I think, where we'd end up at with renovating the existing building is probably 75, maybe a little bit higher than that. Extraordinary effort put in, and, an amazing job on the insulation, new mechanical system, complete gut of the mechanical. We could probably get it down pretty low, 45. The proposed new construction, the EUI goal is 30. And we think we could probably even do better than that, potentially. So all of this obviously has an impact on operating costs. We don't have a lot of analysis on that at this point, but there is a direct impact on that. And the other piece of cost is then the development cost, and that's another piece that we've looked at. We've got some more slides on.
Thank you. So I'm Brian Vanneman. I work with Leland Consulting Group, and we work on real estate development issues, largely for cities in the public sector, so issues like downtown redevelopment, projects like this. And I'm going to address a few things related to value, equity, costs. First, I would say, because as John mentioned, the question has been raised, would we be throwing away value by demolishing this building? And a building's value really is directly correlated to whether it helps you, the owner, to achieve your goals. That's a fundamental issue of value. The other thing is I've got the word sunk and variable costs up there. Those are economic terms that when we're considering alternative courses of action, what you typically do not want to do is consider sunk costs. Sunk costs are any costs that were incurred in the past, in the 60s and the 70s, whenever that was, to build this building, to upgrade it. We want to consider the variable costs, the costs that the city will or will not undertake going into the future. So that's looking specifically at the cost of a new building or the cost of rehab. Whether any money was invested into it in decades past is irrelevant to whether that's going to save the city money going forward. Let's go to the next slide. So another important issue in development and in this site is, as I said, for this building to help you, the city, to achieve your goals. And one of the things we think about is the, quote, balance sheet in development. And when we're thinking about a site or downtown, we think of the ability for the specific site to positively influence development in a greater area. And so I think some of the issues that my colleagues here talked about, accessibility, turning outward and not inward, and that great street from downtown to the river are really fundamentally important. And a new city hall has the ability to encourage development and act with the development on 8th in particular, by turning outward, by showing a friendly and accessible face, and by having public places. And we know that in great redeveloping districts throughout the West, that buildings turn outward and address their neighbors. And so we would hope to see positive interactions both on the site itself, where we're opening up hundreds of thousands of new square feet of potential development, and then also other development in this area.
So I think Brian made it clear that you're meeting your goals is really a primary concern, and we can dive into all sorts of technical analysis to explore things like insulating the building to get an EUI of 45. But the question is, coming back to the overall project, what are your goals? And I think we've, working through the project and testing these, speaking with stakeholders, speaking with you, working on it, we found that, no, they're actually really specific goals for this, and we can measure possible outcomes against these and feel confident about the direction we're taking. So it is possible to dive in and test, well, could you push this here? Can we change a column there? You've really got to step back and say, does it give you an outcome that you want, that meets your needs, your goals, your values? And coming back to it's our last slide, is an image you've seen. We believe that this meets those. If you change your values and you change your goals, maybe something else would make sense. But we really believe that this is a strong direction. And if you have more questions about the analysis we've done or the other options we've looked at or the costs, we'd be happy to answer your questions.
So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to you, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Appreciate, very thorough. Thank you. And I've got George, Brown, Betty, anybody else in the Claire, Alan, George? No. Okay. All right, George Brown.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks for the presentation. It would have been really nice to have all this material in last Friday's packet. We can't possibly digest and respond to this in the 45 minutes left in the work session. I know inevitably we won't even be able to ask all our questions or make our statements. I know that we'll have to carry over for 2 Wednesdays. We've heard a lot about how we can never make this building efficient. The recent study came out, I'm sure you're familiar with it, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It's recently released. It's a 95-page document. I've been reading through it. I'll cut to the chase. Here's one of their conclusions. Here's their conclusion. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, in conjunction with Cascadia Green Building Council, Qantas, Skanska, and the Green Building Services. Here's what they said. For those concerned with climate change and other environmental impacts, reusing an existing building and upgrading it to maximum efficiency is almost always the best option, regardless of building type and climate. Most climate scientists agree that action in the immediate time frame is crucial to stave off the worst impacts of climate change. Reusing existing buildings can offer an important means of avoiding unnecessary carbon outlays and help communities achieve their carbon reduction goal in the near term. The one exception to that they note is conversion of warehouse space to multifamily. That's really hard to make that pan out environmentally. I've got a couple of questions for staff. The city hired Turner Construction in August 2011 for multiple rebuilding and new construction schemes, presentation of estimated construction costs to present to the City Hall Advisory Committee. We've never really heard from the advisory committee. They never really made a report to us. Or did they?
They were not advisory to council. That was put together to be advisory to staff for the purposes of exploring further options and seeing what we needed to explore further. I was very explicit with the advisory committee that they weren't advisory to council, that this was simply to further explore the opportunities and challenges that were inherent with the sort of bookends of the options available to us, from deep renovation to build new, so that we could inform at a high level where we were in that process and determine what to carry forward. As I said in my introductory comments, they concluded that we could go either remodel or build new, depending on what the city wanted to accomplish, but that a great deal more study would be needed for either of those options in order to move forward with them, including additional costing.
Okay. It's my understanding that they took a straw poll vote at the last meeting, and it was 6-3 in favor of rebuild. Is that correct?
That's absolutely untrue. I conducted that straw poll. I went around the table and asked people. Most people were, again, there were a few strong opinions, but most people said, you know what, you really got two good options in front of you here. We really need to study this further, and you need to proceed further, hire a design team of professionals and explore this further, which is exactly what we did. We've included reports from that advisory committee and previous council packets, and links to both studies have been on our website for 2 years, and so the conclusions were not really very determinate. They were that we could go either direction.
What I would add to that too is even if they had done some sort of straw poll, as you know, when we come to you with any number of recommendations, we get information from a variety of sources. In this case, part of that was that particular advisory group, but that wasn't the only pieces of information that we came to the council with. You might remember there was a council subcommittee that was created. A lot of the information from that council advisory group was also presented to the council subcommittee. So all of that work also informed the final recommendations and the final action for the council.
Was a parallel study to Turner's ever commissioned on the estimated costs?
The Turner did costing for both the renovate and the building.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I mean, the group here tonight has disputed Turner's findings most strongly.
No, actually, what
so,
the group...
I mean, did another company do a parallel study?
Yes, our design team, architectural cost consultants, in consultation with the design team and with our contractor.
Can we see that parallel study? Because what we have here in the material tonight is not, I don't see any costs here. I see objections to Turner's estimates, but I don't see any costs presented disputing line by line why their estimate is wrong.
I think
Will we be able to see that information on Wednesday?
I think part of this whole work session tonight is to provide you the information that our design team has. They're prepared to go into much more detail if you need to. I think the part of it is that we aren't disputing Turner's estimate from 2011. Turner, at that time, made the estimate based on the information they had available. I think they would also recognize that between 2011 and today, there has been a lot more learned through the project, which the team has outlined today. And because of that, the costs are just different. And I think one that they mentioned that you don't need a lot of in-depth discussion around is between 30 to 40% of their estimate doesn't include contingencies, which are very standard in the industry, doesn't include a variety of, what was the other 20? Escalation costs. And so I think even without even diving into the detail, it's already 30 to 40% low based on today's information, plus what we know structurally as well as what it takes to be an energy efficient building. So we can go into some level of detail if that's what's important for the majority of the council.
I think it's important to do that. I'd like to point out that the contingencies and cost estimates are going to go up for both rebuild and build new.
You're going to need another round, George?
The escalation is going to be similar for both options.
Another round,
Yes,
George.
another round, please.
Betty?
Yes, that's a good point that George just made, that costs will go up for whatever you do. My question is, if the current team were directed to renovate, could you do it? The entire building?
I will speak on their behalf, having worked with them for the last year and a half. This is a very talented team, and they could do a fantastic job of renovation. It wouldn't meet the current goals that were laid out for you and wouldn't be as cost-effective as new, but yes, they could do a very good job with a renovation.
What goal wouldn't it meet?
Sustainability, energy conservation, even the sustainability question. The publication that Councillor Brown is referring is actually a 2-year-old study. It's not particularly recent, and everybody on this group here is intimately familiar with it, and City Hall is exactly the kind of building that study has identified as not being as good for renovation because of the difficulties that Mark Bernet has explained to us. And so sustainability, civic presence, contributing to economic vitality of downtown, long-term sustainability because the site framework quadruples the amount of building area that can go on the site, lowers ongoing operating costs and maintenance costs. Just if you go down the list, everything on there.
As for welcoming, I don't think there's anything more welcoming than the council chamber, the roundness and the fact you could see in and see out. But when you talk about cost, I think we should also consider the cost of all the rent that we're paying all over downtown. If we did a renovation, we could bring a lot of those people back to City Hall.
The cost to bring all of those back you would have to add additional square footage, which is not a part of the budget. And so even the renovation cost that gets talked about in the press only provides 25,000 square feet of movable innable space, and the current project that's currently being designed also provides 25,000 square feet of movable innable in space. And so we could not consolidate more people just by virtue of going to the renovation at this time without additional millions of dollars to do that project.
Not with using the old fire department space, the old police space.
You still have to have the money to renovate it and to do all of the improvements to it, and so that still takes multiple millions of dollars that are currently not programmed, appropriated, or identified.
And are we considering the loss of the parking and how much that would cost to replace?
I think you guys can talk about the parking if you want to. Or?
Sure. There's various approaches to parking, and there's no question that renovation would preserve more of the existing parking. The problem with the existing parking is the way that it's partially submerged and therefore raises the building off the ground and goes to the difficulty that we're talking about with not connecting to the street and not adding value to the surrounding properties and so on. There are approaches that we could take to deal with parking, and particularly in future phases we maintain the ability to add parking. But downtown we deal with parking in a district format, and there are a number of ways that we could deal with parking. And the problem with the existing City Hall is that it deals with parking in a very suburban way, and rather than in an urban way that actually contributes to the viability of downtown buildings.
Seems to me the hidden parking is more urban than surface parking, which we're talking about doing. I was interested, you said something about acoustics. The acoustics in the City Hall were much better than the acoustics here, so I don't know, and also better than the ones in the library. Thank you.
Claire.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. I really, really appreciate it. I think done an excellent job of addressing some of the major concerns that folks have raised as we've gotten to the point where we're ready to actually knock that building down. Particularly the challenge of the energy situation. I think it's fairly clear to me, energy efficiency-wise, the building is a disaster. And either we spend millions of dollars to try to insulate it and then continue to jerry-rig for the rest of its existence, trying to keep it at that energy-efficient level. That just seems a little nutty to me. But I actually wanted to ask a question about the earthquake retrofit. As a child of Southern California, having lived through a few tremblers, that's of particular interest to me. And the gentleman who presented on that mentioned that there would be, even if we went that route and decided to do a earthquake retrofit, it would substantially change the look, or it might impact the look or the usability of the structure. I'm imagining the underground parking, if it was kept the way it is now, would actually have to have truss beams put down in there. I don't know if I'd love for you to expand a little bit on physically what it would mean in terms of usable space for that building if we did a earthquake retrofit on it.
Sure, I'll be brief. The most economical way and the most straightforward way would be to add concrete shear walls to the building. It is a concrete building. It's just very stiff horizontally, vertically. It's not for vertical movements in that vertical plane. Trying to add brace frames would be very difficult. We've done it before when the owner wanted a brace frame, because that does let in light. You can see through them for the most part. But I would say a concrete shear wall would be the solution. Yes, you would lose parking spaces because concrete walls take up space. They do block light. And the way the building is now, even if we look at the roof, you've kind of got separate pods of waffle slab that form the roof, and each of those separate pods is going to behave like a separate building. So it would have to have its own system of shear walls if we stick with the shear wall solution. A steel plate shear wall could certainly work as well. There are many options. The apparatus bay is also at a different level, so it would require another seismic solution. So concrete shear walls, I think, would be very straightforward and an honest solution to that. However, there would be many of them. And my concern, working with architects and designers, is if the goal is to preserve what we have, it's very hard to preserve that while adding in large continuous walls with limited openings.
Thank you.
Okay, Alan.
Karen, you mentioned that there were 30 stakeholder groups, and you gave us a list. Do you know how many people that included?
We haven't actually added up all of the people at each of those meetings. There were, I would say, in the largest meetings, or the open house event held at the library was, I think, around 100 people. Those stakeholder group meetings tended to be between, I would say, 20 and 50. Some were smaller. The Sustainability Commission, for example, Accessibility Advisory Committee, smaller groups, dozen people, but another maybe 5 people in the room also listening.
So hundreds.
Oh, yes, definitely. Hundreds and hundreds of people.
Okay. Did Turner, when they did their estimate, did they ever do a detailed site visit?
I don't know if they did or not, to be honest.
You know if they came here and looked at the building?
I know that the person who led that effort was from Eugene. So,
okay.
Yeah, I imagine they took a look at it, or were at least somewhat familiar with the building. Yeah.
Since that estimate has been in contention, has anybody asked Turner if they would stand by and guarantee their previous estimate?
Yes, and for what it was at the time, yeah.
Well, I felt it would be important to call Terry Shagru and tell him that we need to look at the 2011 because it's being held up as proof that we can do certain things today and in 2015. And he stands by his estimate for what it was in 2011. But if you change things, for example, the council established the project values, which we see guide the project after that study was done. There's no way that we could have known that those 5 values were driving the project. So that's a high level of decision making, but at the level of the requirements of the project, we know what the actual requirements are now. They were part of establishing in hiring us to do the job, and they're different from what they were in 2011. What he said is it sounds like the project has changed. And of course, with engineers, and we have the benefit of a really great group of engineers working on this. In 2011, there were no technical consultants working. We had to make assumptions. So there is new information, and talking to him, he said, hey, if you have new information, of course we couldn't account for that.
So by that you mean, so you had this long list of inadequacies in this cost and scope of their study, bullet after bullet after bullet, and that is the new information that has come into play since they did that estimate that would, if they were to take this into account today, they'd have to address these issues.
Absolutely.
And that would likely,
yes,
from the information you gave us and from a reasonable person's standpoint, would dramatically increase the cost of their estimate.
Yes.
You can mention his email.
Yeah, we received an email from Terry, from Turner, describing that the purpose of that estimate, and that if you're using that estimate for other purposes, it's not valid for that. You have to look at that estimate for what it was estimating, which is a diagram. We did diagrams of the new, Autopatisha did diagrams of the existing, or the renovation. And for example, here's one, and you know, cost estimating, you have to count things and try to figure out, okay, what's in, what's not in. So for example, the elevator, just to dive into some details, we're looking at the elevator in the renovation scheme, and there's only one elevator. It's the existing elevator. There's no allowance for increasing the size of the pit. You'd have to do that, which means getting into the basement and expanding that. And then you upgrade that elevator and you say, we have an accessible and welcoming city hall, where if you're in a wheelchair, you have to go down Pearl along 7th and in the garage to ride the elevator. That's not in the project. We would never recommend bring a design to you. So there are some big pictures. We've tried to offer you the big numbers in there, the design contingency, which takes care of unknowns early in the project, the escalation, which is just a fact. But there are details and design issues that we would want to get into, and we have. And so looking at the range of options that we've explored, we took a version of the full renovation and really explored it to understand what would the cost of that be. And our estimate gets more around the $21 million range, which if you think about renovating a whole block, doing 32,000 square feet of new and renovating a block, that sounds about right. So when we hear, hey, $11 million can pay for all this stuff, you do need to go back and say, can you really get that much out of an existing building that needs that much work? So it's not surprising to us as we dive in line item by line item in that estimate to try to figure out, hey, what's in there, that, well, it's under from what we know the project to be.
Right. In your experience, all of you, the risk of renovating a building equal to the risk of building a new building?
Well,
in terms of cost.
Yeah, obviously in terms of cost, when you look at putting your total project cost budget together on a renovation project, you would likely, for one example, is carry a larger construction contingency. This is a number that you as an owner would hold because as you begin to uncover things, you're likely to see things that you have to address that no one was able to foresee before you got into them. That number, that construction contingency, which is different than the design contingency that we spoke about previously, would be lower on a new build project because really the unknowns for a new build are essentially getting out of the ground. What kind of subsurface conditions are you potentially going to encounter that you don't? And then the other aspect of that is nobody has ever done a perfect set of drawings. There will be change orders on a project, and that contingency is set aside to address those issues as they come up during construction. But to answer your question, yes, I think in a renovation project, a higher construction contingency would be a prudent thing for the project to carry.
I noticed you guys used the words challenge and this would be difficult. Whenever I hear architects say those two words, dollar signs go off in my head about what that really means. It's just architecture code for this will increase your cost.
I don't think we tried to hide that.
So having gone through all that, do you guys stand behind your estimate of your construction costs for a new building with the contingencies and considering all these inadequacies and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, we have been, you can see the cycles of work where we started with many options, narrowed down, and as you do that, your cost estimating, which is iterative as well, you know more about the project, and so those cost estimates have become more refined. Now, one thing that happens in a project is that there are always more, you have to separate needs from wants, and the core project that began as an $11 million project is achievable in the new build. And one of the reasons is that we can reduce the unknowns in that. So we may have things that we want to do that we may need to do in later phases. For example, we might want to have photovoltaic panels on the building. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, probably not. They're certainly not carried in our cost estimate. There are so when we're going through an estimating process, we're looking conservatively at making sure that we can achieve the quality that we think you're asking for when you describe your values and your goals. But we also need to be able to work with the allowances that we're putting in different areas of the building envelope. When Mark says, hey, we think we know we can get to an EUI of 30, we know that from experience, but also because we're in control of designing the building envelope, whereas if we reuse the structure, we're not in control of that. So the structure's in control. So we can achieve, and it's a balancing act, we can achieve the budget and optimize the response to your values and goals on the budget.
And if I could just add to that, on the operating side, when you look at renovating the existing building, and if we do get down to an EUI of 75 compared to a new build at 30, we're not just talking about initial capital costs, we're talking about ongoing O&M costs. And so you would be looking at the delta of basically 45 EUI times a unit rate of energy going on for the life of the building. So that is not insignificant as well to consider.
Do you know what percentage of a building's lifetime energy use and carbon footprint is embedded in the construction or deconstruction versus the over the life of it, over the use? What percentage is allocated to those two phases? I've heard is like 20% construction, 80%.
That sounds about right. I don't have specific data on that. I mean, the one thing I would say, you know, there is this study from the New Building Institute that talks about the sustainability of reusing an existing building versus building new, which I think gets to your point. And I think, you know, I read through that study, and the thing with this building is that we need to add so much more material to it. There's all of the insulation that has to happen, and it's something that the study addresses, and it says when you're reusing a building but you need to substantially add more material to it, that's when you end up with an exception. And I think that's where we're at. It's, you know, it's not a black and white issue, but it feels like that's where this building's headed. The other thing in that study, their conclusions are drawn off of a baseline building with an EUI of 70. So our building, existing building, has an EUI of 130, so it's 2 times that. Mm-hmm. And all but one of their comparisons were to a new building and an existing building with the same EUI. They did do a comparison of a new building with an EUI of, I think, 30% better than that EUI of 70. Now we're talking about an EUI 70% better or so. So I think both the differences in energy use are substantially different in our building than in the study. And our building just fits that model of needing to add a whole lot of material to it to get it there. It's not, you know, it's not an easy retrofit.
Right, and I always caution people about using studies like that because they're general and they're generic, and those types of analysis need to be building specific. And I really appreciate what you guys have done on the specific building we have here. The new building's about 4 times more energy efficient than the existing building, and maybe twice as much as the renovated one. If I've got it right, to meet the energy code on a renovation, you'd have to basically deconstruct the existing building down to its bones and then build another building around that building in order to have it work, which would mean it doesn't look anything like the old one, and it's really just taking the bones of the building and renovating it, right? And that's essentially what would occur, which is why you get to the more materials.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what the authors of that study have said, that the further that you need to gut an existing building, the closer to just the bones, the structure, that you take a renovation, the more like building new that actually is, because of the embodied energy and all of the materials that you're putting into that structure. It doesn't take into account a lot of the other things about this building that are not average, including the utilization of the urban land and a baseline with that study that basically assumed that what you're starting with in the existing building is the best outcome that you could hope for with that piece of space. And that also is, of course, related to the values of the project and thinking about the goals that the city has.
Thanks.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. Michael, you mentioned that you had previously been one that was leaning towards the wisdom of remodel as opposed to entirely rebuild, and you shifted. Can you tell me the single most compelling reason that you changed your mind there?
It's hard to narrow it down to just...
I know. I'm asking a tough question.
Yes.
I know.
For me, it's the sustainability argument, because Eugene is good about reusing, recycling, that sort of thing. And I just thought it was a very Eugene thing to do, to renovate and reuse the building. But the more we looked into it, the more the severe underutilization of the site that the existing building represents, the poor energy performance we would get even after an aggressive renovation versus the energy efficiency and reduced operating costs that we could get with a new building. It just kept adding up that the most sustainable thing to do in this case is to build a new building. And that's, I don't usually feel that way. I mean, the police building is a great example of an adaptive reuse that was perfectly suited. An office building out on Country Club that really worked well to renovate and turn into a police headquarters. We purchased it and renovated it for about half what it would have cost to build a new building. And so I'm very supportive of adaptive reuse, renovation, deep remodels, and so on. So it's the sustainability equation to me.
Is this let me try again. Is the sustainability value more important than historic preservation?
That's a question of values. And,
right.
And from a value standpoint, I keep going back to the project values.
Let me jump in real quick. I apologize for the interruption. That was a trick question.
All right.
The answer is, that's our job. And I think that you guys, I think that the staff, and I think that the people you've hired to help and to do this work have done a fantastic job of what they were asked to do. I think that the meticulous work with public process has been good. I think all of the ideas and all of that has been brought to us is good. And I think you've managed this well. It is my belief that we have not ever had as robust a conversation, even though this has gone on for as long as it has. A process has to lead to a point where a majority agree on something, and I don't know if we've ever had 6 members of council agree on if they had to set a priority of values, a priority list of which was more important, cost efficiency, historic preservation, which values are most important. I don't think we've given you that clarity. And I think that's the place where we find ourselves right now, is that many people in the community have different values that are more important to them. For me, it's really important that this be very cost efficient in these, difficult times, that we get the biggest bang for the buck that we possibly can. For other people, the energy efficiency and sustainability is the very most important thing, the future vision, the historical preservation. And I think that's the part we would probably serve ourselves well to talk about today and on Wednesday, are those competing values about, from this council's point of view, what's most important. But I have to tell you, from what I've seen, my estimation of where we'll end up has not changed. I've said for a very long time that I don't believe that building will stay standing unless City Hall is somewhere else. I don't believe that we will get to that place at the end of this process. So I say that to be really frank with the members of the audience and the members of the public who are watching us. And I think for good and solid reasons. You've brought up a lot of reasons why tonight. And so I would urge the public testimony and the conversation to focus around which values are most important, because I think you guys have delivered on the ones that we told you we wanted you to. Thanks.
Chris.
Yeah, well, we actually have spent a long time talking about values, but I think the point that Mike makes well is we've never talked about having to trade off values. You have this value and you have this value, and they compete with each other. Which one are we willing to make a trade-off? That's where we are right now, because we've never been confronted with having to talk about a trade-off. And that's a difficult conversation for us, and you're trying to help us with what the trade-offs are. So then it becomes a matter of managing our expectations. What do we think we will get for the effort, the money that we put into it? And for me, those expectations kind of seem like they come in three different areas. The first one is the appearance expectation. What will it look like when we're done? The second one is, what is the functionality and sustainability of what we have when we're done? And then the third one is, what will be the cost efficiency of what we have when we're done? And I'm hearing enormous numbers of expectations around all three of those areas. And one of the things that I heard tonight, which was very helpful for me, was, is it possible for us, given enough money, to create a building that looks just like the one we've got now, yet meets the earthquake, sustainability, efficiency, appearance, standards that we put in place? Can we do that? And what I'm hearing is, of course, you can do anything you want if you're willing to spend enough money. But I'm also hearing that to achieve the earthquake standards, the structural standards, the insulation standards, the efficiency standards, you're going to have to do a whole lot to that building that when you're all done, don't expect it to look like it does right now. It's going to look different. It may have similar footprint, but you got to put like all sorts of exterior insulation. You got to stop bridging. You've got to do things to the council chamber structure in order to make it stronger, so it's not going to be kind of the light building. So I'm hearing that appearance-wise, it would be extremely difficult to make a building that meets modern expectations but looks exactly like it does now. It's really going to be difficult to do, or maybe even impossible. The second one around functionality, the interesting thing that I've not really heard a lot is, does this building work for the people that will be in it, that will be working there? The first thing somebody asks you when you start off with an architectural process is, what are you going to do in that building? And nobody said what is going to be done in that building. Does the current building work well for staff? And in the 20-some-odd years that I've been around that building, in many respects, it doesn't. Okay, so you rip everything out between the inner wall and the outer wall and start over. Well, that's not a little remodel. That's not a renovation. That's significant work. And then the last one is cost efficiency. As I said at the beginning, you can do anything you want to if you have enough money. And the challenge with trying to work within a very limited structure in terms of, well, it's got to look a certain way when you're done, and it's got to work within the existing parameters, means you have to compensate in other areas. Other trade-offs have to be made. And for me, that's a real challenge.
Greg?
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to say that you guys have done an excellent job in kind of recapping and bringing us to where we are today in terms of how we got here. So I deeply appreciate that. One of the things that has been important to me from the very beginning of this process, being kind of the new kid on the block in council, is going to the value of retaining as much of the historic value of the existing structure as possible. can the design team talk about what the possibilities are in terms of retaining the existing council chamber in a repurposed format on the new footprint and what that would look like? And the second question, and this is more to John and to Mike, is can you give us a quick, short overview of what Phase 2 looks like? Because I think that there's some lack of clarity as to what Phase 2 looks like in terms of where the public is, and to kind of bring us back around to what that looks like as we proceed through this particular project.
Sure. So remember in the series of options where we were looking at parts of the building to retain and slide things around, one of them we looked at, well, what if we move, the council chamber is in the middle of the block, which is kind of inconvenient for optimum use of the block. So we thought, well, what if you just moved it to where you want it to be more engaged in the public realm? And it's concrete and doesn't look like it could move, but sure enough, Jim Mender, our construction manager, general contractor, talked to building movers, and it is feasible to jack that up, and I mean, there's a lot of work to do, but jack it up and to move it to another location on the site. It could be off-site. It can be moved. Now, that's just retaining the structure as is, and it's really important. John McDonald was talking about the degree of upgrade that's required to re-inhabit the building. I mean, I don't think in the public realm we'd say, well, it's, we were in there before, well, let's just move back in. It doesn't have a mechanical system. It's really not a building that we can be in an earthquake. It needs work. And in order to do that, it's substantial work. Now, if you changed...
Well, I'm looking at, that as a repurposed facility,
sure,
not necessarily
for the council chamber.
For council chambers, but a repurposed facility for a different use that engages the public in a different way.
Yes.
But inhabited.
And some degree, yeah.
Well, if the use of that circular space as a meeting space, if you start if John gets his hands on it, puts the braces in there that are necessary, it starts to it could still be usable for other purposes. And that would certainly take the pressure off on what it takes to strengthen that. And the other thing is to think about we have a very aggressive energy goal, but there are buildings that don't need to operate 4 seasons, and you don't have to use them on the coldest day of the year. And that's another way to just back off expectations so that you can hang on to more.
Just real quickly on Phase 2, part of what came out of the council subcommittee, which I was probably finishing just as you came on to the council, was a recognition that we wanted to try to live within our means as we move forward on the city hall, and we did not have the means to build a full city hall, which would be upwards of could be 120,000 square feet, excluding police and fire, which was there's no expectation of them coming back. And so what the council chose at the time was, well, let's start off with that Phase 1, get that taken care of with the money that we currently have. And then for Phase 2, which could be up to another 100,000 square feet, the expectation would be that we would have to find probably a different financing mechanism in order to do that. One of the keys as we've gone through this conversation over the last 12 months, particularly in the context of potentially exchanging property for a farmer's market, was whether or not we could actually build that additional 100,000 square feet on a half block with Phase 1. What Rob Brokaw said is, yes, we can do that, and it could fit real well with the rest of Phase 1, but that would have to come as a part of a different financing mechanism.
So we're going to go to round 2 with George Brown, but first I just wanted to say that in terms of our goals, I'm not saying this is a good or a bad. I'm just saying in terms of our goals, it's never been articulated by the majority of this council that one of those goals was to save the city hall as is. So that is just not one of the goals that we've had in front of us, and not one of them that we delivered to the teams. So that's just, people can have very different opinions about that. And the only other thing that I want to say about that is, I know this is a very difficult discussion for people, and I know people care deeply about it, but in fact it is quite possible for good people, smart people, caring people to actually have very different opinions on this, and that we should be able to have this discussion and respect those differences of opinion, because they are always with us, always. So, just saying. And the other thing I want to remind you of is when the federal building was built. And as you recall, when the federal building was built, it had a elevator in a not very handy-dandy place either, and that was the entire way that people had with disabilities had access to the federal building. And this community stood up and said, that's not good enough. This community took on the federal government, who said, you should just be darn thankful you got this thing, and they said, no, we want a building that is welcoming and easy to access for everybody in our community. And that still should be our goal, for City Hall especially. At the time I said for the federal building, if any place should be accessible, it should be the halls of justice. And right next to that I would say, if any place should be accessible in every way for everybody, it's your City Hall. George Brown.
Thank you, Mayor. Looking ahead for Wednesday, I think we need to have a much deeper discussion of Phase 2. I think from reading the materials, rebuild and reuse sets us up in a much better position for Phase 2 for the 40,000 square feet of extra office space than building new does. It'll cost a lot more to build new if we destroy everything and start all over again. So I think we need to look at that a lot closer. I would also like to see I'd like to see some dollars put to these missing cost and scope lists that you've provided us with. I mean, it's one thing to list all these things, but we have no idea what that means in dollars. And I think that we need to see that, because otherwise you're just making a statement, but you're not, offering concrete proof. I don't know that we've seen detailed construction cost estimates for the build new. I think that we need to see that so we can compare it with Turner's estimates for rebuild. Because otherwise, there again, we're just in this vague area. Oh, there's $15 million to spend, and we can do that. Well, I'd like to see a breakdown. Perhaps not as detailed as Turner's cost estimate. I mean, that would be ideal, but something. We really haven't seen anything real specific yet. And also, I think we ought to discuss, no matter what we do on Wednesday, I mean, I think we should direct, we may want another meeting, who knows? But I think we ought to direct the manager to go back to the selected demo. I mean, there's no reason to delay that, taking off the fins and removing the HVAC and, interiors, walls and stuff. That's going to happen whether we tear the whole thing down or whether we do a rebuild. So I think it's okay to go ahead with the environmental remediation. The asbestos has to come out no matter which option we choose, finally, whether rebuild or build new. So I don't have a motion prepared for today, but I think we ought to direct the manager to go ahead and do that and inform the teams to do that, because that's got to happen no matter what else we do. So I think these would be good topics for Wednesday. Thank you.
So, City Manager, before I call in Betty, I want to know, with the things that Councilor Brown and George just asked for, are they within the realm of us getting that information to people? Is that call for something that we need to have a motion? I just want to understand that.
I'm not sure what they have or don't have in what format, so I would have to.
You got 36 hours.
That's what I was thinking.
And,
I'm looking for your...
I guess what would also be helpful to know is where the majority of the council would like us to spend our time between now and Wednesday.
So let me just pose this to you. We sort of set up this meeting as an information meeting and not a motion meeting. On the other hand, my experience is that we should never think we said something unless we voted on it. So I'm just looking for...
And let me ask, I'm not sure how much information you have, or we could go through it, or...
Well, a lot of effort in the last week or two has been put into updating the information around the remodel option, because that was the oldest information and needed the most updating. However, the cost information that was developed for the new building option has been sort of internal to the team for informing their decision-making process, and at this point isn't in a format that's ready for prime time and all cleaned up and spiffed up. It's informed their decision-making process, and they have a really good sense. But I'd be hesitant to try to promise really good information by Wednesday that's ready for full public scrutiny and review. We were heading toward that in the process as we were moving forward, but I'm not sure we're quite there. Is that fair?
Remodel.
Well, I'll be thinking about how to think about this. Betty, you're next.
We've got it for the remodel piece, but not the new isn't to the same level, because we've been focusing more on tightening up the remodel in the last 2 weeks.
Betty?
Thank you. As one good person to another, as the mayor said, good people can disagree. I disagree that we never said, I think we voted to keep the council chamber, and that, I think, says that we wanted to keep it. We voted to keep the parking and as much of the building as was feasible. And that's the last time we voted for anything. I have a question for John. Are you saying that we could not bring back, a lot of people had moved out of City Hall before council did, before the city manager's office. Are you saying we couldn't bring back the people that moved out?
Of course we can, and I think what the council has talked about in the past is, as we move into a phase 2, that we would want to consolidate those people back into the city hall.
But couldn't you bring, if you just rehab, why there's as much space there as there was, why couldn't you bring them back?
You can't move into the space, and so it may mean that there's a shell, and but there's no interior. There may or may not be all the electrical, mechanical. It may not have the same energy efficiency. You sure don't have all the interior places you can actually work, and the technology and those kinds of things. So all that takes additional money to actually do. So it's not, you just can't move into space that's been shelled.
You can't rehab or repair the whole thing under the budget. You can't bring, lots of buildings have gotten new heating systems since steam heat went away.
Right. What we can't do is bring it up to current code and standards, meet energy goals, meet seismic goals, operational efficiency goals by doing just a repair and rehab.
And has anyone thought about, you talk about a second phase if we repair what we have now, has anyone thought about selling the atrium and using that money to work on City Hall?
If we when we talk about financing for phase 2, there could be a variety of ways in which we choose to do that. I should mention that we talk about having leases out in and around the downtown of $1 million plus, which is quite a bit of annual lease. But if you convert that into a borrowing, you're not borrowing $50 million with a $1 million annual debt service. You're closer to probably, I don't know what it is now, 12, 13 million, maybe you can get more than that. So we're not talking about bringing everybody in, being able to build the square footage required to bring them all in for the amount of money that we save on our annual lease payments. So that won't pay for bringing them all in. And I just want to make one clarification, is what the council motion wasn't to save as much of the current City Hall as practicable. That isn't the motion and the direction that the council gave us. What the council said is build on the current site. We want to build new, but we also want to keep the council chambers. There was specific direction on that, and we talked about sort of the pros and cons and options with that. Save as much of the underground parking as practical, and save the art, and that save any other piece, use any other piece if it's operationally, makes sense operationally or from a design standpoint. It wasn't the expectation that we save as much as possible, so it's actually just the opposite direction. So I just want to clarify that.
Okay, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. When you're asking the question, what best can you be doing in preparing for Wednesday, from my point of view, it's help us get through the values discussion, because you can bring back all the numbers in the world and we can have a comparison of these guys' numbers and those guys' numbers and the cost efficiency, but then we're only talking about cost efficiency and we're not talking about the other parts. Help us talk about which values are most important to us so that we can see it clearly and be able to explain to the community, well, most of us think it's most important to look at the long-term sustainability of this, and that's what it is, and here's why. If we can all explain that well, I think we get to a better place for the community as a whole. So help us deal with those conflicting values. That's what I think will be best.
I'm going to call on Alan, but in the meantime, I'd like to ask George to formulate a motion for the materials that you would like to have, and we'll see what if the rest of the council wants that same information. Okay?
And then either tonight or tomorrow.
Need tonight.
I mean,
yeah.
So they have time to prepare.
You can do it at the end of the meeting tonight.
You could do it at the 7:30 one.
Yeah.
That'll give you some time to work with Glenn. Okay, so Alan.
I actually suggested that in the last work session, that we continue on with the removal of the fins and also the asbestos abatement, both of which were going to occur regardless of what we had. And I think staff said yes, that was true and that we could do that. So if the motion were to formulate around that, I think that's what I was talking about before as well. I agree with what you said earlier, Mayor, that we should be clear about what we're saying and give direction to staff. And to date, we've had pretty much informal head nods as we've gone through this process and not had motions. And I suggest that on our process that we work through a series of very specific questions or motions that make it very clear what the majority's intent and values are, and thereby at the end of that process, at the end of the next work session on Wednesday, we will have very clear direction on very specific questions. Embedded in all of that is the values that we bring to this conversation. We don't have to have explicit voting on which value is better than the other one, because I think that one would take forever and we wouldn't agree anyway. And I have some suggestions that I could forward to the mayor if that would be helpful for specific questions to get us down the road.
Oh, I appreciate that, Alan, because as you know, I sent you all a email asking you to think about that very thing, so I really appreciate you bringing it forward, and I would appreciate hearing from all of you that want to give some input into that ASAP. And so what we're going to do right now is, it sounds like when we start our 7:30 meeting, we'll have one motion on from George about what he would like staff to bring back, and we'll have another motion, which George mentioned earlier, he can do two if he wants, is the one on or someone else can do it, it's up to you, but on the need to move forward.
Do some of the demo that would be done regardless of the options.
That's right.
That would be the.
That's right. With that, we're going to say thank you very much for your patience and goodwill. Thank you.